We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Amber Mace. I'm the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology. Welcome to our briefing. This is a series. This is number 3 of possibly more, we'll have to see, on wildfires. And this is something that we do at the California Council on Science and Technology on various topics. So if you have a topic you'd like to hear from some experts about, we'd be happy to hear from you and put together a briefing. And this is an opportunity for us to advance our mission, which is really focused on connecting with our partner institutions, their experts. So this is UC, CSU, Stanford, Caltech, our national laboratory partners, and community colleges, with decision makers and interested public and stakeholders such as yourselves. And this is an opportunity for us to share a little bit of information. We know an hour isn't a lot of time to delve into what is a very complex topic that has a lot of information behind it. We see this as an opportunity to connect you to experts who then you can follow up with. And so we see this as the start of a conversation. So we're thrilled today to build off of our 2 previous briefings, which were on technology use in responding to wildfires, and then environmental and health impacts of wildfires, to talk about forest management practices today. And I am honored to introduce Rob Oglesby. He's a council member for the California Council on Science and Technology. He's a former executive officer for the California Energy Commission, and he has decades of environmental and energy policy experience. And he's going to lead this discussion with us today.
Thank you, Director Mace, for the introduction. And let me also thank the audience for coming to participate. I'm honored to be the moderator for this session, and we have a distinguished panel here of experts that relate to forest management and fire. And the way we're going to proceed today is to basically have some opening comments and self-introduction from our panel member, but we really want to engage you and give you the opportunity to learn from the panelists, ask questions, discuss issues. And so I will turn to you and solicit questions or conversation from you to engage our panelists on that shortly. But before that, let me start by asking our panelists, going from my right, to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves, the institutions you represent, and a little bit about your expertise and your focus in your current positions. I'll start with Dr. Collins.
Hi, I'm Brandon Collins. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Amber. Thanks to the council. And thank you all for coming. I'm a research scientist. I have a dual appointment with UC Berkeley and the Forest Service Research Station. It's called the Pacific Southwest Research Station. I've been in this field for 10 to 15 years, and most of my research has been in the realm of fire, of course, and in particular, I've had a few things that I focus on. One is sort of the historical role of fire in our forests and how that sort of structured our forests, if you can think about that. And to that end, how have forests changed? How have fires changed from what we know, how they burned historically, and in response, sort of where do we think our forests are headed? And then also another sort of realm, which is somewhat related, is what do we do to alter the effects of fires? I think it's kind of it's not probably terribly well understood in the general public that we don't do forest management to stop forest fires. We try to change the effects of fires, and we can talk more about that if you want to follow up on it. So we've done a lot of work that's something we call the stand scale, and really that is something on the order of, let's say, 10 to 20 to 30 acres or something like that. And we have basically exhausted that research avenue, and I think the next thing that I'm particularly interested in is pushing that to a much broader scale. How can we treat landscapes, watersheds on the order of 10,000, 50,000 acres, and you know, sort of apply some of those results we got at the local level, but it really gets more complex at the large level. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thanks for turning out. My name is Don Hankins, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at CSU Chico. I'm also the director or the president for the California Indian Water Commission, which is an intertribal organization. I'm a practitioner in terms of burning on the cultural side, having burnt on 2 continents, doing about 20,000 acres of burning without red trucks. in a huge diversity of different habitats. I also do research, as Brandon is talking about, mostly looking at the application of fire, primarily through the indigenous lens of using fire as an ecosystem management tool to restore landscapes, ranging from riparian woodlands along the Sacramento River up into the chaparral, oak woodlands, and up into the pine forest in the Sierras. My work and what I really strive to achieve is the application of fire back into the landscape. And obviously we see this problem at the state that really needs to be addressed, and that is something that I try to do either through my teaching or through my research to be able to achieve that. So I'll leave it at that.
Hi, my name is Susie Coker. I'm an extension forester for the University of California Cooperative Extension. We're a network of researchers and educators across the state of California. I am county-based, so I serve the counties of El Dorado, Amador, Calaveras, and Tuolumne counties. My job is to help private landowners understand how to manage their forests. When I first started in my job, I lived in South Lake Tahoe in 2006. I worked with my community after the 2007 Angora fire to talk about reforestation and rebuilding. And after that, I basically did a lot of responding to wildfire disasters to help landowners understand the next steps for forest management, forest development, reforestation from the 2015 Butte fire, the 14 King fire, and the 2013 Rim fire, which are all in the areas that I serve. After that, we had a huge bark beetle outbreak, so I started working a lot more on helping landowners with understanding the dynamics of forests with a big drought and bark beetles. And then since then, which that's died down a little bit, I have been focusing with a number of my extension colleagues on helping build the capacity for private landowners to carry out prescribed fire. We have an initiative across the state where we're working with landowners to help educate them on the use of prescribed fire and try and build up a more fire culture within private lands in California. And I'll pass it on.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this obviously hot topic. My name is David Sapsis. I'm a wildland fire scientist that works out of the Fire and Resource Assessment Program for CalFire, the state's fire service and forestry department. I've spent the bulk of my professional career in this position. I'm working on my third decade trying to get a handle on understanding the nature of fire in this fire-prone and complicated place. My focus has generally been on providing a science basis for understanding the role of fuels and weather in determining fire behavior, and then, as Brandon pointed out, linking that fire behavior and occurrence of fire events to impacts. Fires are not intrinsically bad to forests. Certain kinds of forests burn typically under certain kinds of environmental conditions and drive certain kinds of ecological responses. And in many cases, those communities were well adapted to a particular kind of fire regime. That is, the relative frequency of which the fire occurred and the nature of the fire. For example, there are some forested types that are really designed to burn as very high intensity crown fires. And they're really adapted to that. They've got soil, they've got seeds stored in their crowns that then the cones open and disperse onto the ground, and the forest comes back very plentifully. There are other forested types that respond substantially different than that. So again, the work that we do at FRAP is really designed to support land management, fire management, infusing it with an understanding of fire science and impacts, and to develop rational policies in the face of sort of an emerging set of conflicts that are pretty clear to everybody that it's not that the fire is necessarily the problem, it's the wrong kind of a fire in the wrong kind of place. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. And in recent years, we've had way too many wrong kinds of fires in the wrong kinds of place, which I suspect is why everyone's here today. every year seems to be a year where we break records on the amount of destruction of wildfires, and both huge natural costs and personal costs, public costs, and costs in life and destruction. So it's a time where there's a great deal of legislative interest in how to deal with the threat of wildfires in a number of fashions, either hardening services, fire prevention, fire management, but also looking down the road, dealing with how to manage our forests more effectively to get the ecosystems working more along the lines that they had been historically. So I want to ask the first question to Dr. Collins if you wouldn't mind kind of framing the challenge that is before all of you as you work in this field in dealing with the nature, what's happened to our forest lands leading up to this point that's resulted in where we are today. Do you mind?
Not at all. Sure, so I'll take that on, and knowing that we're sort of now we've zeroed into the forest realm, and understanding, as Dave alluded to, that we are so we span such ecological gradients in California that we really can't we can't generalize sort of fire patterns and change in ecosystems. So for now, we're going to zoom into the forest, and even at that, the mixed conifer forests, which is where we're seeing a lot of the fires that are so problematic, that are forest-based. Of course, granted, we can talk about grassland and chaparral in a very different context. But what I will say is this: there are a few things that are not really up for debate anymore in the science, if you can believe it. We know that forests have been altered substantially. We have data from multiple different sources. We have reconstruction studies based on tree rings. We have old data taken around the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, late 1800s. All of these different records point to the idea that forests in general, now I'm spanning over some serious variability, but in general, were much less dense than they are now, meaning there were a heck of a lot less trees. Anywhere from 5 to 10-fold less dense than what we're seeing now. That is just flat out counting the number of trees per acre. Now, if trees alone were the only issue, then maybe that wouldn't be such a big deal. But it's the type of trees that we're seeing that are more problematic. We're seeing a lot of small trees that are sort of what we look at trees usually oftentimes by their diameter. And these are trees that are sort of less than 12 inches. Those are the problematic trees because they have their crowns low to the ground, and as a result can vector fire up to the crowns of the big trees. So that not only do we have sort of this continuity that goes from the ground level up to the tops of the big trees, we have horizontal continuity because the trees are so packed in. So trees aside, we also have a major accumulation of surface fuel. Fuel is frankly just dead plant material, and a lot of times it's branches and needles of trees from which the old mechanism of regulating that accumulation was fire. Fire burned every 5 to 15 years in these forests. We know it. We have so much evidence of that. And it did that for thousands of years, and we sort of shut that out with our contemporary management that started around the 1900s. So we've done a very good job of keeping fire out. Believe it or not, it doesn't seem that way, does it? But if you compare it to sort of our estimates historically, we are really have depressed fire on these landscapes, and as a result, we've seen these structural changes and changes in fuels, which then have created this sort of wrong kind of fire that Dave Sapsis spoke about. In that we're seeing fire now that is killing big trees. When historically fires did not kill big trees, it burned along the surface. It sort of was that regulating mechanism, keeping density in check, keeping fuel accumulation in check. So that's a broad overview, lots of generalization there, but we can follow up if we need.
Thanks, Dr. Collins. Before I solicit a few comments or questions from the audience, I wanted to observe that we have a new governor, and this governor is one of his first actions made fire management, dealing with fire and the threats of fire prior to his administration, and to that end did an executive order asking CalFire to take some early quick actions to deal with priority projects. And I was hoping, Dave, you could kind of give an overview of what's being done as this first level response. It's not forest management, but I wanted to per se, but I wanted to make sure we have that as a foundation for the discussion going forward, as well as forest management practices.
Well, the department has been on record for a number of years recognizing the need for significant levels of fuel treatment to improve forest health and protect communities. I think the governor coming in shortly after recent circumstances was basically saying we've got to start doing something really right now. And these projects came in from the local managers with local knowledge about short-term, immediate kinds of activities that they could engage in places that are crucial to protecting communities. And it's important to recognize that we actually ran some analysis on these projects, looking at them in terms of their hazard, risk to ecosystem services, and risk to vulnerable communities, and ranked them. And so the selection process involves some pretty sound analytics, but they're really just a first step. They're designed to get done quickly and show earnest intent to start to tackle what is kind of a global problem. The segue from Brandon's comments are these situations are extremely widespread. So the 35 projects designed to get done and implemented this year are not going to solve the larger problem. They will be hopefully quite effective in the areas that they are implemented, but the extent of the problem is significantly greater. And hopefully the trends that we're trying to develop, both in terms of policy funding, development of implementation, precision, if you will, is going to improve over time.
Thanks, Dave. I mean, you winced when I said it earlier. I draw an analogy to sandbagging the levees when the water is rising. These are the first line projects that were prioritized.
Exactly. These are the things that we think that we could get accomplished quickly. It's important to recognize that part of the problem, part of the issue of difficulty in developing sound and effective mitigation strategies is you got to define the problem, then you got to define the solution. And we've been fairly adroit at problem statement definition, getting projects on the ground that are effective, that really do what you want them to do, is difficult. And developing the sort of institutional inertia to get larger and larger capacity to develop that, I think, was one of the guiding principles in the governor's decision to sort of inject some funding, some mechanism to get this ball rolling, because I think the current social climate says we got to be doing something. And again, I think as scientists and fire managers, we've been saying this for quite a long time. Again, I don't want to date myself, but I think back to I was a graduate student at Berkeley when the Oakland Hills fire occurred, and my high school actually burned in the fire perimeter, and they called me up to talk at a forum at the school. Much of what I said in the winter of 1992, I still say. The messages have not been changing. I think that there is an opportunity right now to really take the situation that we see as existential and really work from that.
Thank you, Dave, and hopefully we'll be exploring some of those themes in a minute. But I want to take a moment now to solicit any questions or comments that might have at the audience today. And all you have to do is raise your hand, and I will call on you. Mr. Wenzel.
Hi there. Thanks very much. My name is Mark Wenzel. I'm with the California Environmental Protection Agency. And I have a question first for Susie and then for the rest of the panel. And that is, so I didn't know that prescribed fire on private land was possible. I would think that liability would be an obstacle. I'm really curious to hear more about what that looks like and what you think the opportunities and deterrents are. And then for the broader panel, and maybe especially for Brandon, because you brought this up first, on a landscape scale, especially in California where we have a lot of checkerboard lands, what does a public-private partnership on landscape look like?
Two good questions. Susie, you want to start?
Sure. Well, prescribed fire was prescribed against in the 1920s on public and private land. It's been become legal since about the mid-1940s. There was a whole period of range burning in the mid-40s and 50s in which California ranchers and their range improvement associations were actively burning landscapes in the mid-50s. They burned about 200,000 acres a year throughout California. And indeed, it was the liability issues that caused people to stop doing that. Our liability laws could be better. In private lands in Florida, for example, private landowners burn about 7 million acres a year in Florida in 2017. They have a different definition of liability. You're only liable for effects if you were grossly negligent. We have a plain negligence. Sorry, I'm not a lawyer, but there are some liability issues that are a barrier, but that doesn't always stop everyone, especially if you're doing it in low hazard conditions. So we have the first prescribed bird association in the West was started up in Humboldt County with collaboration from one of my colleagues up there, and they've burned hundreds of acres in the last year and a half on private lands as a cooperative association of landowners. So it's definitely possible, and it's definitely done so much better in other states, including the Southeast and the Midwest. In the Midwest, you can see ranchers burning 100,000 acres in one day on private lands. So it is possible. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to that. So definitely liability is a big issue for landowners. As a private landowner, you would take responsibility. And basically anybody who sets fire takes responsibility for the fire that they set to the ground. And that is one deterrent that keeps some people from going about burning, even though it's the right thing to do. I think that those kind of deterrents are really challenging when we look at other regions, not only within the United States, the Southeast U.S. During, like for instance, in the Midwest, months of March and April, mid-March to mid-April, 2.5 million acres on private land burnt in Kansas and Oklahoma, set by private citizens. Why is that able to happen there? Why is it able to happen in the Southeast? And yet we see this problem in California. We know what needs to be done, and then the biggest risk I see in terms of where the most frequent fires happen to be on private lands. So if we empower citizens, train citizens to be able to set fires safely and effectively and ecologically responsible way, then we should be able to get ahead of this curve. One of the potential limiting factors, there's a couple of limiting factors that I see in that. One is availability of people to assist with those kind of things. So the cooperative burn associations is one avenue of that. In the neighborhood I live, neighbors work together to be able to kind of pull these projects together. And nothing at a landscape scale at this point, but the vision is there for sure. And then, you mentioned that you work for EPA, and I think one of the biggest issues that I kind of see out there, again, and this is supported by some of the research, is that the air quality situation is something that we need to consider. We've got the factors of how many permissive burn days do we have per year, and what's the acceptable background level of smoke within the environment that we can live with. I look at the Western Regional Air Quality Standards rule from like 2005. There's some very interesting exemptions there. I mentioned that I work with tribes quite a bit, and one of the exemptions that's there in those standards is that tribal burning, even at a landscape scale, is not regulated under those rules, and yet certain air districts within the state have implemented policies at the local level that don't allow for that cultural burning to take place. So I see a huge opportunity for tribes to partner with agencies and private landowners if we were to shift the rules here to be able to get some more burning done. So those are just a few of the things. I don't want to take all the time around that, but those are just some of the things that I see around that.
I think you're up, Brandon.
Okay, so with regard, you bring up a good point with regard to the sort of watershed level, landscape level, treatment, and what I'm getting at with that, with the idea of sort of scaling up, is the idea is that you would sort of coordinate your activities, whether they be prescribed burning, thinning, across a landscape with the expectation that you don't need to treat every single acre to get a benefit of a quote-unquote landscape project. You can actually treat somewhere on the order of 30, 40, 50% of the area, and you can get sort of off-site effects, is what they're called, is you can actually get a reduction in fire spread rates, a reduction in fire intensity, such that from the treated area, such that it sort of fires lay down a little bit, even in an untreated area, because they're on the lee side, if you will. So, I mean, we've shown that from a simulation standpoint. We've never really, we have a few examples where we've actually put something like that on a landscape and they're not in checkerboards. But I think another thing that's pretty darn important is the recognition from multiple landowners that indeed there is this fire problem, and that sort of the business as usual management is not necessarily dealing with that problem. And what I'm getting at there is that there are a host of folks that think that their forest management activities are actually quite effective. You know, forest management activities largely driven by timber, the production of fiber, also serve purposes from a fire hazard reduction, and it's not entirely clear that they do. In some cases, they may exacerbate fire behavior, particularly in very young forest stands. So I think that if there's sort of that recognition on both parts, both, let's say, the public and the private side of this fire problem, that there's going to be a need to shift sort of the business as usual to sort of achieve that common goal across the landscape. And it's not that every single acre needs to look like X or look like Y. Just needs to have some type of discontinuity in fuel, some type of reduction in the surface fuels, in the ladder fuels that are the small trees that sort of are growing up under the big trees. You just need to do something and do it in sort of a coordinated manner, knowing some of the fire patterns on a given landscape that is sort of driven by wind patterns and things like that.
So lawyers and pesky air quality regulators are part of the issue. Can I look at the audience? Are there any other questions at this point? Great, in the back.
Do you see utilization of biomass facilities as kind of an essential component of forestry management moving forward? You talk about mechanical things of that nature, but what do you do with it once you have it on the ground? Do you see biomass versus just prescribed burning as something that should be kind of expanded on moving forward?
Who wants to field that?
I can talk to it a little bit. I'm also on the timber and biomass task force for the CalFire, and so I know this is a huge issue in that particular area. We don't have a biomass facility nearby to deal with the 600,000 plus trees that are in the 153,000 acre footprint of the CalFire. The facility that was in Orville was closed down 6 years ago, and all the wiring and everything came out of it. So that leaves us with a really interesting situation. Do we truck, the trees and the slash and whatnot great distances like to Lincoln or to Honey Lake or places like that, which some of that is happening. But my question on that is, well, what's our carbon footprint of that activity? If we're dealing with CO2 emissions that's already off the charts, what can we be doing in the landscape to do that? I think on the timber production side of it, I think if you can bring in chip trucks and while you're removing logs, remove the slash, that way there you're reducing the fuel load in that regard, that makes sense. At a landscape scale, it doesn't make sense. It's too, I don't know the numbers on it, but it's just way too much in terms of those emissions. And I even think about like the saw work. I heard a piece on NPR last year at one point where they're talking about the emissions of saws in California exceeding the vehicle emissions. And I don't know the specifics of the time frames and so forth, but it's like, wow, if we're treating things at a landscape scale, how are we contributing more to our problem in terms of the climate change aspect of it and the CO2 aspect of it? So I think if we can do things on a finer scale, that's great. At the landscape scale, we still need to be looking at the prescribed burning as the main way of doing it.
Has there been any analysis of prescribed burning versus trucking? Because what I've seen is I'm using rail spurs and things like that I'm an SD1, so we have a lot of the Sierras and everything like that. So it's just a constant issue because even if you have a small scale facility, there's no way to actually get that into the grid in a feasible manner.
Right.
I just wanted to add that any and all tools are useful, especially around communities. I do think prescribed fire is possible around communities, but where you have the infrastructure to do biomass processing, that's a great solution. We used to have a very robust biomass industry before a lot of the contracts expired. And it was more possible to pay the way out of the woods of some of that smaller material that is not economic to turn into logs. And so I would welcome any and all efforts to try and expand our local biomass capacity. We're trying at a pretty small scale at this point, and some of those facilities have issues with licensing and all of that, but yeah, whatever you can do to help actually use materials, I think that's great. There are going to be plenty of places away from those types of areas next to rail lines where we'll need to use prescribed fire or other methods as well. So any and all tools in the toolbox are super helpful.
I'll add one more thing if I may, in that in areas where we've seen sort of the loss of the biomass, ability to move that, what we're doing essentially is just burning the stuff in giant piles. If you drive up Highway 50, you've seen it. Those are kind of mild piles. Once you get away from the forest a little bit, you'll see piles the size of houses, small houses that are going up, and those when they burn, they're not burning under terribly efficient burning conditions. They're burning in the winter under a dusting of snow, and you're creating a heck of a lot of smoke and getting nothing in return from an energy standpoint. So I think we have to think about the alternatives here. You have to do something with that biomass. Either it's going to go up in an inefficient pile, or it's going to get trucked away, or we're going to burn it under prescribed fire conditions. But it has to be dealt with one way or another.
I wanted to add one more thing and think about the timber and biomass side of it on the CalFire. There's a couple of biochar companies that have come in and talked about the opportunities around biochar, which would be excellent in terms of locking up the carbon in black carbon that's stable for long periods of time. But their capacity, even if they were to amp up, and have enough time and space to do this, would only max out at about 12,000 acres of treatment per year. So how many of these facilities do we want to see? At the lower end, they're looking at about 1,000 acres per year. So somewhere between that range is kind of limiting when we think about the problem that we're facing. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah, and just to add one little wrinkle on this, I think echoing all of the comments, biomass actually is absolutely, I think, part of the mix in dealing with all of this small diameter material that really drives surface fire spread. And we're actively engaging in some fairly cutting edge research to look at technology, what kinds of technologies like biochar can come to bear on it. But fundamentally, you've got a lot of very small diameter material distributed across large, vast areas of land, and the collection of that material is really kind of inefficient. And so the economics of biomass need to get linked in with other forest operations to prove to be economically viable. And then you need to have people that want that material. So like has been stated, when we had a viable biomass system, there were facilities out there to take the material, and that's gone away. And we will not be able to re-engage, reinvest in new facilities without some assurance of a material supply over time. So there's, I think, some fundamental longer term kinds of policy questions to address this if it's really going to be part of this longer range solution.
Great. Any other? Okay, please.
Thank you. I'm Michael McGuire with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I got a question here kind of following up on that comment on biochar. Also known as the biochar czar at OPR, so I guess it kind of my question is this: what connection, if any, have you identified in the course of your research in the loss of charcoal stocks in forest soils and a reduction in drought resiliency and overall forest health?
I'll say that for my particular research, where we're doing a lot of prescribed burning, this is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, but with a lack of funding and a lack of equipment to be able to do this. I do have a civil engineer at Chico State who's willing and very interested in looking at this to help me to start to quantify this on the burns that we're doing, but currently I don't have data on it.
Very good, do you?
I do not.
Well, maybe a funding priority.
Chat about it.
Great.
Please.
Can I ask you, Michael, can you repeat that exact question again, but slower?
Sure. Let me do it again. I got it down.
I know you do.
What connection, if any, have you identified in the course of your research in the loss of charcoal stocks in forest soils and a reduction in drought resiliency and overall forest health? I feel like you can email it to me.
All good. Thank you.
Cool.
That also triggers in my mind thinking about kind of policy level things, and some of you may be aware, but you may in particular be aware of it, that in Australia they have a carbon marketing system that pays Indigenous rangers to go out and do burning, and I see that as a huge opportunity here for being able to use some of our money currently under the funds for the carbon offsets. Some of those funds are being sent out of state, And I think, those monies need to be used here to help to reduce this. But I think if we're able to do the types of burning that need to take place, it should be done locally. And we should be able to quantify it and show that trade-off with that stabilization of carbon in the soils through research to back it up.
Sure. Thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions at this point from the audience? I have one. So we've albeit for the biomass industry, which I really appreciate your question on that. It obviously triggered a lot of discussion and pointed out how it's complicated. I certainly agree with the comments about being part of the toolbox, but having to overcome barriers that make it hard to be a silver bullet, and kind of a niche solution that has to fit with both the energy infrastructure and the transportation of the mass. I would add that the legislature has added a mandate biomass recently as a matter of policy. So it hasn't completely replaced the QF contracts that expired, but it's kind of the same jumpstart policy directive that the legislature recently gave in a small way that recognizes that biomass can be a part of the toolbox tools that are available. But the question I wanted to talk about, a lot of emphasis on this panel is about prescribed burning or managed burning, and Dr. Collins, you also were very useful in highlighting how you don't necessarily have to treat 100% to get benefit. California has a pattern of development and growth that has residences and communities interspersed with forest lands, and I wonder if someone could help me be more comfortable with the idea that if there was scalable burns, that how you accommodate areas where you still need to address forest health, forest management, and do that in an area which is at great risk because people are it's a populated area now. It's not like the forests were 100 years ago where we look at the historical stands and use of fire and there were a whole lot fewer people. So can someone help me get comfortable with how that would happen?
Well, I could give you an example. I live in the Tahoe Basin, and the fire protection districts on the Tahoe side of the lake, the Nevada side of the lake, are currently doing prescribed fire. They have active crews in Incline Village, the North Lake Tahoe Fire Protection District, and then the Tahoe Douglas Fire Protection District. They run crews and they burn right up to $1 million homes. So it is currently being done. I think the people there feel comfortable with it after learning about it. They've done a lot of work in outreach and extension and working with their communities. They were able to pass a tax on their parcels that hired fire crews to do this work. So it's not out of the question, and it happens in locations right now. Yeah, I don't know if you live there. Meeting your local firefighter, meeting the crew might be what would do it for you. Talking to your neighbors, a lot of how people feel about things has to do with their social networks. So I think having a robust local outreach effort by fire practitioners is key. And I just wanted to refer to some of the educational materials that I brought. As an extension person, I don't ever go anywhere without it. So in fact, I have a couple of copies of the Forest Land Steward newsletter that I work with CalFire. And to the earlier question about is prescribed fire legal, I brought the agendas from one of our prescribed fire workshops, which describes all of the content of those. And then I also wanted to mention on this idea that it needs to be done locally and that we would need to work with people. The bill that's SB 462, which I know is before the legislature right now. It has a component with California community colleges to fund curriculum development for workforces, but it also has a component with the California Fire Science Consortium to fund positions for people to work in communities through the University of California and the consortium. And so that would be like 20 more people to work in local communities and do outreach, education, and hopefully evolve to a more fire-adapted culture and use of prescribed fire.
To get back to your question, Rob, this is something that I get asked quite a bit, thinking about the extent of wildfires like the CalFire. Should people be living in these places? And the one thing that I like to come back to, and knowing the landscape history on the tribal side of it, is that people have always lived in those places. But the thing that's missing is that the fire, in terms of the use of fire, is not there. So Native peoples lived in flammable homes. They use fire as a way to protect those homes. So how far away from those communities are you willing to allow for fire to come in to maintain it, so that you minimize the ember showers that come in and propagate these fires? That's a really big thing. There was a really nice piece that I saw yesterday out of KQED that was actually highlighting Rancho Santa Fe down in San Diego County, and some of the policies, I guess, of the ordinances that they put in place for the structures. So if we think about structure changes and funding for people to be able to upgrade their homes to the most current standards, that's a really important thing. In time, that's going to shift. Buildings need maintenance. So if we're going to be thinking about this, it's kind of two-pronged. It's the house itself, which is like standing dead fuel in the forest, and then there's the treatment of the forest itself. So those things have to go hand in hand.
Great, good responses. Thank you. Anyone else from the audience? Quick check. So we're with a panel that's very comfortable with fire as a forest management, and we've talked a little bit about liability barriers, which have to be one of many complications with the larger scale, with the scaling it up. Clearly, it's been something that you've been aware of for decades, as referenced, and yet we still have forests that aren't managed as they should be. So I wonder if we could explore a little bit more about two things. What are the barriers to scale up more proper management of forests, particularly using fire? And secondly, what should policymakers? I mean, we're talking. Our audience here is largely folks that either directly or indirectly influence legislation, make policy, and allocate resources. What types of barriers are there that this audience could benefit from understanding, because they're in a position to participate in the discussion on how to address those barriers? I'm going to start with Dr. Collins and ask if each of you don't mind making a comment.
Well, I'll try to be brief on this one. This could go on for a while. On the federal side, the barriers are many, and essentially the forest managers, the silviculturists, who are the ones who essentially kick off programs for doing forest management, they're in a box. They have a small window of decision space. That box is driven partly by economics. Like Dave mentioned, we have lots of small diameter trees that are worth nothing and in fact cost a lot of money to get rid of, but they're the large source of the problem. Another piece is on the regulatory side, at least with regard to other resource concerns. That includes wildlife, that includes concerns over soil impacts and impacts to water courses. And then we also have some flat out sort of, as we might consider them, legal constraints, even on the federal side with regard to things like wilderness. If you look at individual national forests, when you start to strip off some of the area that is sort of available for treatment, and this is for mechanical treatment, this is for thinning, when you strip off wilderness and some of these other concerns with regard to slope and with soil and water, you're talking about somewhere from the order of 20 to 30% of that entire national forest. The national forests are about 200,000 acres, maybe, actually they're bigger than that, sorry, they're several 100,000 acres. 20% of them, 30%, maybe 40% as you get up into the northern part of the Sierra are available for mechanical treatment, but in the southern Sierra it's less than 20%. It's an incredible amount of area that just cannot be treated mechanically, which points to things like fire, like we're talking about. But I don't want to sell you entirely on fire, because it's not the only solution. In fact, just given some of the other constraints I think they'll talk about, that it has limited application as well because of things, just nature, weather and things like that. But I will say that there are some things that we can change. Some of those things are not set in stone. Wilderness is probably pretty well set in stone. We're not going to mess with that. But some of the other things we can start changing, that is operability on steeper slopes. We have better equipment now that doesn't have the soil impacts. we can start balancing things like wildlife habitat. They don't need to be no-touch zones. The wildlife are getting impacted by some of these fires as well. So having a short-term impact perhaps from a mechanical treatment relative to the long-term impact of a fire and loss entirely of trees, those are things we need to be able to deal with in a pretty, we can deal with them in a sophisticated manner and sort of move beyond those barriers. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I see kind of two key areas where there's issues, and I speak of this from a practitioner standpoint. In one side of it, where working with agencies to do burns, one of the biggest hurdles for them is doing the environmental compliance. One, they may not have the staffing to know how to write, say, a CEQA document. And the one on the other side of it is, well, why are we doing CEQA on something like a prescribed fire project when fire is a natural part of the system? If we're doing it under certain conditions and those conditions are being met, why are we doing CEQA on it? That's not to say I would like to see a complete shift where we're not doing CEQA on any of these projects, because sometimes we have people who are in charge of these fires that aren't thinking about these things from an ecological lens. But those are really important things to think about. You know, the biological and the archaeological side of it are linked together. On the cultural resource side of it, a lot of these burns are actually could be done in a way that are protecting these cultural resources, so that when there is a wildfire and we've got a dozer line being cut, it's not going through an arc site, it's not going through a sacred site. It's being done in a way to protect those areas so fire doesn't get in there in the first place. So I see that we could be doing some shifts around CEQA, some exemptions. If these categories are met, then CEQA doesn't apply. The other side of it is the staffing. A lot of funding obviously gets spent on suppression, but doing the proactive treatment, a lot of the agencies just don't have the funding to be able to do that. And so if we can build a capacity through funding, partnerships with private entities to be able to burn across all lands, and it's kind of this theme of all hands, all lands. We often hear this in the fire world. If we can build that capacity, do the right kind of training, then we can definitely get there.
I just want to bump off of that. Lack of knowledge, especially in prescribed fire, in our agencies and our with landowners. It was illegal for some time, and it's not been practiced for decades. And so we have a huge need to learn more and to train up together, just as he said. The other place I would go is for private landowners who want to manage their landscapes and do thinning and mechanical treatments. It still can be an insurmountable barrier for people to go through the regulatory process to develop a forest management plan and then not have a market to sell any material. So the cost is high. We have a number of cost-share programs, including CalFire's CFIP program, California Forest Improvement Program. There are some size limits on that. I think you have to have at least 20 acres. We used to be able to group up together, but apparently recently new lawyers said you had to have that minimum size. There's also working with landowners after their property's burned. There's a time lag going forward. Really, when you want to reforest after an event like that, you want to get in the first couple of months, the first year. And going through a grant process can really take some amount of time and can allow a lot of competing vegetation to grow. So in my perfect world, we would have some more rapid response to some of these wildfire events where we could come in as a team and expedite funding for landowners who want to reforest and to try to manage their landscapes. So we could get the work done more quickly.
So I guess what I would like to sort of contextualize, you just heard from the three previous speakers a whole litany of obstacles to doing treatment, and we basically also said that the demand for treatment is extensive. I've kind of come up with this strange microeconomics metaphor for thinking about this in terms of demand, which we've got lots of, and opportunity, which is difficult to come by. There are physical barriers to doing mechanical based on slope. There are monetary barriers because a small private landowner with a block of land that is choked full of forest is looking at really, really high costs to get that forest into a resilient stand condition. And So obviously, subsidization of that under the guise of public good seems like it would be sound policy. I think collectively, as we start to really fundamentally address forests and fire and systematically develop pilot work that highlights and showcases how this work does not cause adverse environmental impacts, particularly if it's contextualized against the wildfire. The opportunity cost of not doing these treatments is the wildfire. And trust me, all of us can take you out to places on the landscape where they're largely nuked. They're, the entire soil profile, organic matter, was consumed by the heat of the fire. So I think we're in a situation, a bit of an inflection point for policy, where there is social capital to start to work and whittle down on these barriers and develop sort of some institutional momentum, if you will, and really highlight the really fantastic work that's happening in some places in spite of all of these impediments. And then work to systematically, whittle away at all of them.
That's great. Thank you all. Let me ask, are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Please.
Hi, I'm Sandra Lupian. Following up on what you just said, Dave, I'm wondering if anyone on the panel could talk about some successful examples of partnerships and models that have been working in California, like some of the master stewardship agreements that have been put into place, or Good Neighbor Authority working really well.
And I think following along with an early comment about scale and landscapes, again, when we speak about watersheds, most folks kind of understand those. Those are pieces of ground that capture water supply. Well, around the turn of the century, the 21st turn of the century, we adopted a term called firesheds because the scale at which wildfires are occurring are roughly sort of similar to these watershed scales. And that ought to be a lens of scale focus that we're starting to address on. And as soon as you do that, you realize that you've got a number of players out there, and it doesn't have to be checkerboard. As soon as you go to 100,000 acres of scale in fire-prone landscapes with high hazard, you're inevitably got a bunch of players. And getting those together to communally agree on things is intrinsically kind of a hard thing to do. But we've been really working on it. We've got MOUs of agreement among multiple agencies and participants. We're working collectively with NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, who holds land and wants to do work, and focusing on building landscape level agreements with, currently the state through stewardship agreements and Good Neighbor Authority is moving some of our dollars to do work on federal land. It recognizes that the fire is not going to respect a jurisdictional boundary. There is no change in the system that defines the private land from the federal land as the fire burns across it. So I think that you're hitting on something that resonates with all of us. As we scale this to the landscape, we've got to address the complexity of who the players are, bring them into a common arena. And I think as scientists, we need to be able to convey with really effective kinds of information. And this is hard for us because scientists, we always deal in uncertainty. We don't prove stuff, we disprove stuff. And getting them enough information that is sound to build on, I think, again, and really trying to focus on short-term successes that breed this institutional momentum.
Thank you for that question. Any other questions from Dave?
Yeah, Dave Spelms from the Energy Commission, and sort of the trend you're sort of generally talking toward is recreating forest structure more similar to historical conditions. And I wondered how the effects of climate change then on forest structure and composition might factor into that. Is that trying to capture something that's changing anyway, and how would you factor climate change into thinking about this forest management treatments?
I'll answer it quickly. I think with regard to sort of using historical conditions, they're oftentimes a guide, a little bit a reference, and not necessarily a point that we want to sort of get back to. And in that respect, we sort of understood that fire happened in that landscape, but yet there was a decent amount of equilibrium, if you want to think of it that way, where large trees were still present around the landscape. We didn't have giant sort of treeless patches. Yet fire was acting freely. Now, granted, the climate has changed, but the point is that I think we still are within the envelope. For a lot of the mixed conifer forested region, we're still within the envelope under which we can retain mixed conifer trees. It's just we need to be able to manage the structure. There are certain areas on the margin, on the lower ends of the elevation perhaps, under which you may not probably be able to retain what was there 100 years ago, and you might very well just sort of welcome the shift, if you will. But I don't think we're there yet in a large part of the mixed conifer zone. If we do, we're talking about a wholesale shift that is going to have huge implications, carbon, wildlife, you name it. But I just don't think we can throw in the towel yet and say climate's changed and therefore let's just let things fall where they may.
This is actually a question that I think about quite a bit. And looking at the Paleo Ecology record, we can look at shifts in vegetation communities over time. So as the climate's got wetter or drier, the density of different types of vegetation have shifted. And in the 100, 200 years of fire suppression, type activities in this region, we've seen a downward shift in some of these trees, more density of trees. We've gone into a wetter period, and we're seeing larger fires. But one thing that's always been constant is process, and that process has been fire. I like to think about that fire mostly being controlled by people setting those fires. And so if we put process back in place, then that system can adapt and shift and become more resilient through change in the future. And we, as Brendan says, we're not past that point yet.
I agree. Don't give up. I had plenty of landowners who lost 90% of their overstory trees, mostly pines, who would call and say, I am so, well, they wouldn't exactly say it, but you could tell they're very angry at their pine trees. And they were looking for anything else in the world that they could plant because they were worried that their trees would just die again. And I tried to assure them, we've had 28,000 years of pollen records that show pine was a strong component in the Sierra Nevada. And so there are still plenty of great places to grow ponderosa pines and mixed conifer trees. So I don't think we should give up. We need to have a more resilient structure. And that has to do with density as well as structure. So many fewer stems per acre in the landscape, but definitely a forest going forward.
Yeah, and I think, the natural systems themselves are remarkably resilient. They're going to persist. They're going to do well. I think the wild card is us as humans, as society. And we've boxed ourselves in with some interesting conflicts, I often sort of joke around, the appropriate fire regime for a house is nil, right? We don't want to burn down houses, and yet we plunk down houses right in the middle of, classically understood frequent fire regimes that now have had fire removed from them. So I think there's really an amazing amount of opportunity to actually use the driver of change that climate change is implicating as incentive for us to engage in active management of the forest, because we need to be doing that anyway. So it's just like another exclamation point on us to keep our heads up and actually engage in this problem. Because honestly, I'm optimistic that we can really substantially improve the situation, doing the kinds of things that we've talked about.
That was an excellent question to end on. I think it gave a good opportunity to look forward and look past at the same time. And I want to thank you all for coming here and participating in our discussion today. Also want to thank Assemblymember Woods for arranging the room very kindly and making it possible for us to bring this distinguished panel to you. And I also hope you will join me in thanking the panel for coming here today and sharing your points of view.